To tonight's Legal Immigrants of Colorado Immigration Task Meeting. We have a fantastic speaker tonight, Mr. Hans Meyer. Hans is the founder of our law office. His practice specializes in immigration law and removal defense, criminal defense, conviction relief. He also addresses the immigration consequences of crimes and the civil rights of immigrants. Hans advocates for the statutory and constitutional rights of immigrants before various immigration agencies and state and federal courts, often against governmental and institutional abuses of power. Hans is a former director of public policy for the Colorado Immigrant Rights Coalition, where he focused on local, state, and national immigration policy. As a nationally recognized expert, Hahn frequently lectures, publishes, and appears in the press on issues related to immigration law and the criminal justice system. He's been honored for his public interest litigation and advocacy by the Colorado Criminal Defense Bar, the American Immigration Lawyers Association, and the Colorado Hispanic Bar, among other organizations. He serves on the board of directors for several nonprofits, including the Colorado Criminal Defense Bar, Colorado Criminal Justice Reform Coalition. Grew up in Aurora and is a 2006 graduate of the evening program at the University of Sturm College of Law. In his former life, he spent several years living, working, and traveling in Latin America, focusing primarily on human rights issues in Guatemala and Chiapas, Mexico. Hans regularly appears on behalf of immigrants before agencies, including the United States Citizenship and Immigration Service, as well as in immigration cases before the Denver Immigration Court, the Board of Immigration Appeals, the United States District Court for the District of Colorado, and the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals. Hans also represents non-citizen defendants in criminal cases and petitioners in post-conviction matters in state district courts, the Colorado Court of Appeals, and the Colorado Supreme Court. Hans has had success recently in federal district court challenging ICE's unlawful arrests of immigrants and policy of keeping detainees in prison for a period of time after they've put bond. We are grateful for his steadfast protection of the civil rights of immigrants in Colorado and honored by his willingness to speak to us tonight on his important work. Thank you so much, Hans.
Well, thank you, Kathy. That was probably much longer than you needed to do for my intro. I'm Hans. I grew up in Aurora. Nice to meet y'all. There's a couple people on this call that I've met and or worked with before in the past, and it's a pleasure to be invited. Thank you so much. Can everybody hear me okay? Is my sound all right? Okay, great. Well, I know we've got an hour, and what I always try to do is end early so that people like me. So, I'll maybe try to get us wound up 5 minutes early. Is that what we set for? Kathy, was it an hour?
We
Or
are
Beth?
for an hour.
Okay. And I
We
am
didn't want
happy,
to take too much of your time.
okay, well, great. I kind of left this agenda open because things in the civil rights space for immigrants are in such a state of chaos or flux that I would be curious if there are sort of general subject matters that people would like me to address. Because I would like to sort of address things that are popping into people's heads or that people are seeing frequently. And I don't know, Kathy and Beth, if that gets too complicated if people come off mute. But is it possible to maybe drop a couple of subject matters into the chat group and I can kind of take that and run with it?
I'm sorry, Hans, my it's going in and out, but please, people, just put your subjects in the chat. Know that
Okay.
you can't talk about specific cases, but concerned about due process, arresting immigrants without due process.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
you know, some of your work about that.
Yeah, absolutely. I would love to. So maybe and I'll keep dropping those in there and I'll kind of try to address all those. But let me start off with maybe what I'll start off with is what I see as sort of the state of play with the civil rights of immigrants, especially in Colorado, right? I mean, there's a national, but this is the League of Women Voters for Colorado. And I do think there's an importance to the local and the state level. Um, and interestingly, I was just talking with my former work spouse, who I think is probably the best champion for immigrant rights in the political sphere, whose name is Julie Gonzalez, who's running for US Senate. She is an unabashed champion for civil rights for immigrants and has been an incredible leader. So, um, you know, I'm not going to pitch her candidacy, but if you're concerned about civil rights for immigrants, Julie's the person you need to talk to. She's a wonderful advocate. Um, what we're dealing with, I think, in this world right now is a whole scale assault on immigrant communities, which is no surprise, and a whole scale abandonment of any constitutional or civil rights respect or protections by ICE. That's also not really a surprise. I think everybody kind of knows that conceptually. And I say this with a little bit of a grain of salt because, there are legitimate law enforcement agencies out there protecting communities, and ICE is not one of them. I'm just going to be blunt, right? There is no system of checks and balances on that agency. They can and do kill people with literally no repercussion. That is a daily occurrence. They beat and intimidate and brutalize parents and children and disabled people and all sorts of other groups of folks who are immigrants, pregnant women, which may resonate with this group of people, and anybody else they can with abandon. Now, you don't have to believe me, and I don't really care if you do, but I'm telling you the truth. That didn't used to be that way, right? It used to be that ICE could be an agency that would enforce the law and that would respect constitutional limitations. We're just past that world, for better or worse. Um, and there's lots of reasons for that. The primary reason for that is that people are incentivized and rewarded for doing that in the enforcement space, and that there's no checks and balances that are meaningfully keeping people in line with constitutional protections. Specifically, as that's playing out in Colorado. In Colorado, we have passed, Julie, myself, and some other community groups and organizations and elected officials have passed a series of protections designed to protect civil and constitutional rights for immigrant communities. And that relates to people who are both victims of crime, who are immigrants, people navigating the immigration system, people charged with low level offenses like traffic matters and other things, and just people who are trying to live their lives and take their children to school. And those protections have done a lot of good in our community to making immigrants feel like they can trust our local systems. And that includes police, law enforcement, prosecutors, courts, and others, because they know that contacting local law enforcement won't necessarily result in being sort of kidnapped and given to immigration and disappeared from the country, right? So that builds in what we call a lot of community safety guarantees because, if someone robs Kathy at gunpoint and an immigrant sees the robbery happen, they're more likely to call the police and try to help Kathy find the perpetrator. That's not that complicated. But if they fear that helping Kathy would in any way jeopardize their ability to kiss their kids goodnight, they're not calling anybody, right? That's just common sense. Um, so we've worked really hard to do that for 15 years. And the Trump administration has come in and they're very unhappy with those protections, right? Because that makes it harder for them to engage in a mass deportation agenda. And it makes it very hard for them to cajole or convince or force 20,000 local law enforcement officers to basically become de facto ICE agents. So that's sort of the state of play that we found ourselves in coming into Colorado. And what we're seeing is that ICE has, obviously, I think everybody here knows $75 billion was dedicated to ICE about half a year ago. I think that was a 700% increase in their budget, if I remember correctly. And then I think it was today that the House voted, I believe, on the $70 billion additional funding for ICE for enforcement for the next 3 years, which basically removes any sort of functional oversight, right, over ICE operations by Congress, because really the power of the purse is how you control agencies from, overstepping their limits. So we're going to be in a world of enforcement, regardless of what happens in the November elections, for at least until the end of the Trump administration. That's going to be immigration law, is going to be pain and suffering and enforcement and arrests and family separations. So what the Trump administration is doing is it's ramping up detention capacity. It has fired any immigration judge with even the appearance of neutrality and has installed partisans into the immigration judge space. I believe it's 180 immigration judges who have been fired. They are not neutral, independent judges. They work for the Department of Justice, so they actually work for the Trump administration. Um, and then they've sort of weaponized immigration enforcement. And what I mean by that is they have basically specifically gone out to target as many populations of people as possible. The talking point is always somebody dangerous. But the talking point with anything when you're covering it up is always that it's something dangerous, right? The statistics don't lie. The statistics indicate that about 70% of people who are picked up by ICE have either no contact with the legal system or some sort of traffic stop, right? They're very modest things that pretty much everybody on this call has had. But what they're doing is engaging in de facto racial profiling, arresting people, putting them in detention, and then finding ways to argue that legally they can't get out, right? And so the state of play for people is once you're swept into that legal system, there are ways for us to fight to get you out, but it's expensive. So I'll just pick somebody like let me take a look at Margaret Matt Markey, who's right there. Margaret looks like a very sweet person. And if I was a nice agent and I wanted to separate her from her family and children for the rest of her life and crush her soul, I would arrest her and I'd put her in a cage, right? Now, in a pre-Donald Trump, Margaret or her family might hire me or somebody else, and we would argue to get her out on bond because Margaret's just not a dangerous person. She's lived here forever and she's got family here. And we would get a bond and she would get out and we would go to court and we'd fight her case. Maybe we would win it, maybe we wouldn't, right? And Margaret would follow the process, and if she won, she'd stay, and if she lost, she would leave. And what was happening now is the Trump administration is trying to advance new legal arguments to keep everybody in detention at all times with no right to bond at all. So the same Margaret that everybody knows and loves and thinks is wonderful and who has never really done anything wrong, is now going to be in immigration detention. And unless she can navigate a really hostile system and pay 200 to 300% more than she would previously pay for my work, because it's 200 to 300% more work, she's never going to get out. And when she can't get out, she'll give up, right? Because she'll lose her home, she'll lose her job, she won't be able to support her children, her kids will start having mental health issues, they'll need to go to therapy. She won't hack it in detention to fight her case all the way through, even if she's got a good one, even if I could win it for her. She'll look me in the eyes and tell me, I give up. And that's the goal, right? That's the enforcement goal of the administration. So I hate to be, a Debbie Downer in the sense of sort of describing that in very concrete terms, but that is a reality that we're facing. So we could talk about some of the things that we can do in response, right? Some of the ways that we can organize both at the local level, politically, legally, as communities to sort of respond to that paradigm. Let me jump into some of the comments and some of the subject matters that we have here. And let me just take a look real quick. Let's start off kind of like with a little bit about detention, right? And how people end up in immigration detention. And this is a way where folks, and there's a lot of sophistication in here. People talking about being in detention for more than 3 and 6 months following a removal order. It gets very specific. And so I think what I want to talk about is how do people arrive in immigration detention? And one way is by being picked up at courts when they go to solve like a traffic case or some sort of other case. Another way is when they post bond, if like they were to get arrested for like driving without a license or, shoplifting or some sort of, public order crime. And the third way is just ICE going around and just looking to stop people that it thinks are immigrants. That's how people end up in detention. One way that I think this group can support the work to try to promote the civil rights of immigrants and to keep the Trump administration from its worst excesses is to work with the state and local elected officials in your community. There are a lot of laws that are already on the books, right, that protect people from these sort of civil rights violations. And really, the important thing is to make sure our elected officials are actually following those laws. And I know that seems silly, but like the law doesn't matter if it's not being enforced correctly. And this can be very specific as it relates to are local judges allowing ICE into courthouses, right? Shouldn't be happening. Are local sheriffs in the back pocket of ICE to turn people over all the time? That shouldn't be happening, right? Those are things that in the law themselves, we've drawn boundaries around those to make sure that doesn't happen. But it does take a little bit of oversight. It does take sunshine to make sure that, things stay disinfected, right? In terms of enforcing law as it's written. I think the second thing is helping support immigrant community members with action plans and daily support issues if and when people are picked up. Because what I can do is help people legally. What I cannot do is provide therapy, a meal, a ride, or get kids to school and back, right? And make sure they're safe. So I think integrating into communities and just having that support like we would give to a neighbor or like we would give to a friend can honestly make a really big difference between a person having the infrastructure to fight their case and giving up. So I think that's an important thing to think through. In the detention space, we are basically dealing with arguments that the government is advancing, saying that nobody's entitled to bond. And another reality and another thing that we need to get out into communities is it is worth fighting your case if you're picked up. And it doesn't mean that it's a lost cause, but it's a lot of money and it's a lot of time, you know. And it might take you $10,000 to fight to get a bond. That's not what the bond costs. That's the fight to try to get one, right? And that could be 2, 4, 6, 8 weeks in detention fighting to get that. So that means not only are you not working for 2 months, you're spending $10,000 maybe to try to get a bond. And then if they set a bond, you're trying to pay it. So another way that I think other people can coordinate is working with nonprofits that try to help people get out on bond. I think there's one called the Colorado Immigrant Justice Fund, right? And I'm not involved with them, but they help with people posting bond, and I think it's a worthwhile organization that's worthwhile to support. Another organization that's worth supporting is the American Friends Service Committee. They do a really great work in terms of know your rights training and monitoring ICE and doing rapid response networks. And very specifically for us as a community is joining what's basically called the Rapid Response Network, right? And that's a network of people who volunteer when they're available to be on call if there's an ICE operation in their community to go out and monitor it and to make sure that ICE isn't breaking the law and that they aren't violating people's rights. It doesn't necessarily mean people don't get arrested, but it might really do a lot to de-escalate a situation. And it might provide a lot of infrastructure, including video and testimony, that can help us in the future in court, right? Because that can make a big difference in holding the government accountable further downstream. So there's a couple of things that people can do in civil society side of things to be able to promote and protect immigrant communities. So that's kind of maybe that's the starting point for the conversation. maybe I just pause right here and see if anybody has any sort of specific questions around the detention space um, that I can answer. Maybe drop them into the chat and I can try to answer them directly there. And then I will kind of go back to some of the other detention related questions and we'll move on. While I'm waiting to see if anybody drops a note in on that, there was a comment, I think it's from Mina, who mentioned something about for-profit prisons like Geo lose money if immigrants are released and they do not have replacements. That's correct. This is at its core a money-making business, right? Geo makes about $150 a day from taxpayers to house immigrants in detention, probably 80 to 85% of whom present no meaningful risk to the community, right? So we're paying, the immigrants are paying, and Geo's making tons of money hand over fist. So that is definitely a reality, and it's one thing that we've been working on a local and state level, which is to limit the opening of new detention centers, right? To try to keep more detention centers from being set up in Colorado. There's one planned in Hudson. There's another one planned down near Walsenburg. And I think the political organizing and community organizing to try to prevent those detention centers from opening is a real opportunity for us, right? To keep ICE from exponentially increasing the amount of detention space that they have. Perfect. I think Carol mentioned joining a rapid response network in her community, and that it's a great way to stay informed and help with mutual aid. And I would agree 100%. To me, it's a very tangible way to connect, and you can control the amount of commitment you make, right? It could be 2 hours a week, could be 10 hours a week, but also aligns you with other people who are trying to stand in solidarity with immigrant community members, helps keep you informed, and helps you sort of, lend your skill set and your knowledge to supporting people in a time of crisis. Let me look through a couple of other detention centers questions. Yeah, Amy and Adriana, I think, mentioned detention after being released from jail after posting bond or bail. That is a large issue, a really big issue. And there are certain strategies we use to try to keep that from happening that I probably just won't talk about right now. But that is an issue. And so if you have someone who for some reason lands in jail and needs to post their bond, that is a really important moment for them to try to make sure they have an attorney who really knows what they're doing, who can help them navigate posting that bond, getting out and taking care of whatever issue they have, while also avoiding being picked up by ICE. Safe bail bondsmen in Colorado. That's a great question, Patty. I don't have a list of safe bail bondsmen. I'm not sure if the bondsmen are turning people in. There's not really a great financial incentive for them to do that because we have a statute that allows people to get mostly their bond money back, but it's possible. I think more likely than not, if someone's being picked up at the point of release from jail, it's because when they're arrested and booked, their fingerprints are shared with ICE. ICE knows who they are, knows where they are, and can figure out when they're being released and come grab them. So I think that's probably more likely to be happening under the circumstances. Maggie had a great question. Are people who have no documentation put into detention and then deported or held for some time? Yeah. So what I'm describing, Maggie, about the change in the detention process is when I was using the hypo of Margaret. I was assuming that Margaret was a very kind woman who came into the country without permission maybe 20 or 30 years ago, right? And built a life here. Maybe she was fleeing domestic violence. Maybe she was fleeing poverty. Who knows what she was fleeing, but she needed to find a better life. And she did. And she found one here, right? And prior to the government's new interpretation, she would qualify for bond and she would get out. But the government's new interpretation basically is looking to keep an extra 8 million people in detention, right? And that would ostensibly try to keep all 8 million people who entered the country without permission in detention when they're arrested. Now we're fighting back against that. We have a class action lawsuit that our office has filed with the ACLU. We're fighting that issue. We hope to win it. But that's an example of how the government has tried to sort of reinterpret the law to be a lot more vindictive and a lot more aggressive towards immigrant communities. Um, Celeste and Rob had a great question about detention as well, which are people being detained purposely moved to other states to make it harder for them to organize a defense and have family support. 100%. That is an active strategy that ICE and the government uses to basically lose people in the detention space. And if they can move them away from family and attorneys and support networks, it becomes a lot harder for them to keep wanting to fight their case. Um, let's see. There was a couple other detention questions. Is there any way to get more information about the conditions in the detention center? Great question, Kathy. Uh, I think AFSC and CERC and a couple of other organizations do have reports on conditions in the Geo-Detention Center. CERC is the Colorado Immigrant Rights Coalition. They're great places to go, and you can pull down information and reports on conditions of confinement. Our office, my office, and some other nonprofits have a class action lawsuit that we filed against Geo. This is 12 years ago for basically what's called forced labor. And so we have been fighting that case for 12 years. It's taken a lot of twists and turns. It's gone up to the Supreme Court on some legal issues, but we will probably be going to trial in November. So we will see what happens in November. But one of our goals with the lawsuit is not only to force Geo to pay people that it is otherwise functionally forcing to work, but to make it difficult for that business model to be productive, right? Because at least if they have to pay people, it becomes a less lucrative detention space, which at least makes it possible that it could become a space in which there's more services, there's more fairness, there's better conditions. And so that's one of the goals of the lawsuit. And so we'll see what happens. We're hopeful, but we'll see what we can do. Yeah, there was a Denver Post article about Geo trying to sue back today, right? And this is a real testament to passing some legislation that can push hard for accountability. And I love that Geo filed suit today, because that means that Geo's scared. That means that the law could be effective, right? And could actually make the conditions of confinement better. So I think it'll be a very interesting, I don't know the details of that lawsuit, but we'll see how it plays out. But I do think those are examples of how at the state and local level, we as communities can build protections in around our immigrant community members to help protect them from the worst excesses of the Trump administration. All right, let's see. Let's talk about a little bit. There's a question in here from Marcella about victims of crime. Maybe let's touch on that real quick, because I think that's an important thing to talk about. And I also think that is something that as members in the community, you might be able to get information to people or at least support them. There are legal protections for victims of crime to be able to seek either temporary or permanent protection or status in the United States. And it boils down, generally speaking, into three categories. One of them is called a T visa. One of them is called a U visa. And one of them is called VAWA. Now there's others, but those are the sort of the three big ones. A T visa is someone who's been trafficked into the country, usually either for labor or for sexual work, right? That provides protection, work authorization, and eventually a pathway towards residency. A U visa is for a victim of crime, and the U visa is pretty well known in community now, And that's a situation where if a person's a victim of a violent crime, let's go back, and I keep sorry to pick on you, Margaret, but let's say Margaret was the victim of like a car robbery. She might be able to qualify for a visa and protection under a U visa because she helped local law enforcement investigate and prosecute the crime. So those avenues still exist, and there's still ways for people to seek protection while they're also seeking accountability through the legal system. This is one of the reasons why we passed these laws to separate local and state governments from immigration enforcement, is because if we weren't separating them, people wouldn't call, they wouldn't report crimes because they'd be too afraid about the possibility of being arrested. And then there's a third option, and that's called VAWA, like VAWA. And that's a benefit for people who are victims of domestic violence, right? And that could be a victim who's a woman, it could be a victim who's a man, it could be a victim who's a child or a parent, if they can establish that they're the victim of domestic violence. And if their abuser or the perpetrator is a resident, like a green card holder or a citizen. So there are some pathways there for victims of crime. And we've made a lot of progress in 15 years working with state and local law enforcement and elected officials on making sure people actually know how to identify those issues and help people seek protections. So that's like a bright spot in this vista. So I do think that that has opened up a lot of options. Um, Let me see here. Let me pivot over real quick to a question that Patty had, and this is me going backwards into the detention jail space real quick because I missed this, Patty, so I'm sorry. Um, what defines collaboration by law enforcement? Our local jail allows ICE to park their vehicles in their building and garage. When the person is released from jail, they were escorted to the garage where ICE vehicles were and then detained. So, Patty, you are identifying a practice that is right up to the point of breaking state law. It's like right up along the line. Here's what the protections allow. Here's what the protections don't allow. State law that we passed is very clear. Local law enforcement, there's not one local law enforcement officer in 20,000 people who are law enforcement officers that is allowed to enforce federal immigration law. Not one, zero. They cannot make arrests for immigration. They cannot detain people for immigration. Period. So that's very clear. What local law enforcement is allowed to do in collaboration is call, email, talk with ICE. So if a jailer has somebody in detention and ICE sends them an email and says, "Hey, we have an interest in Hans Meyer. We think he might be undocumented. Is he posting bond?" Then the jail could say, "Oh yeah, he just got a PR bond this morning. He's going to get out at 1 p.m. If you want him, show up at 1." Right? That is nothing that we can prevent. That's something that federal law requires the ability to do. And that those are the limits between the two. But the jail can't hold Hans Meyer for an extra day or two until ICE shows up. If Hans Meyer gets out on bond, they have to release him. If ICE is there, they can apprehend him. If ICE isn't there, they have to let Hans go. So that's where the differences are. Here, what you're describing is ICE parking in the garage. That's probably not illegal. We tried to pass a law prohibiting ICE from doing stuff in certain areas of jails, but we weren't successful. Um, the port where they're escorted to the garage and handed over to ICE probably walks right up to the line of being illegal. Probably. But the details in that become very important. And whether or not we would ever be able to like solve that problem in the courts is a different question. That's where community pressure becomes really important and community accountability for our elected officials so that we're not letting people do that where they walk right up to breaking the law or step over that line. Let me take a look at a couple. Oh, Kate provided some information about a resolution on guidelines on reporting and training mechanisms for the Lakewood Police Department on interactions with ICE, which I think is fantastic. Um, that's wonderful. And I'm sorry, I'm just catching up here. Uh, yeah, Kathy, I think you have a great question. This is the one about third country removals, right? Where a person has protection against being deported back to their country, usually based on a fear of persecution, right? And so ICE is looking for other countries to take them. And that has been a big battle in the courts, right? You know, this has been going on for about 18 months. but ICE has been successful in deporting some people to other countries. Um, because the protection against deportation usually only applies to the country you're from, because it's usually based on your fear of going back there. I'll give you an example. Like some good examples are people from Cuba. Like a lot of people fled Cuba, have a fear of going back there. Maybe they were political dissidents. Maybe there was some issue that went on that they could be jailed or tortured or killed for their activities. But so I can't send them back to Cuba because they've won something called withholding of removal or protection under the Convention Against Torture. But ICE will and does, and occasionally is successful, resending those people to Mexico. And there's not necessarily a protection in the moment from removing them to Mexico. Now, there's a bunch of battles in the courts about, well, if you're going to deport this person to Mexico, that person should have the chance to say, well, I'm afraid to go to Mexico too, right? And be able to argue why they shouldn't be deported to Mexico. But this is an example of where ICE is just, um, shoot first, ask questions later, right? So ICE is not really worried about whether what it's doing is legal. It's worried about whether or not it can get the person deported before someone like me can get him out. That's basically the race, right? Um, this is a great fear for an immigrant living with me. He is withholding of removal, but he fears being sent to a third country. Can we really fight this effectively should it occur? Yeah, I think it's possible to do so. Is it El Fride or El Friday? I do think it's possible for people to do that. I would really suggest a person who has that scenario, maybe go talk to an immigration attorney and have a little bit more of a granular, more detailed conversation about their actual specific concerns and whether or not that's something that is really something they should be worried about. And if it is, how they can come up with a good plan. Um, and I think that Megan did make a comment that as much as it's a Debbie Downer, she's not wrong, right? The cruelty is the point of the immigration enforcement space. And that's true, right? And maybe this is a pause real quick to talk about one thing. And this is another thing that I think this group can be very effective about. Yes, the cruelty is the point, but cruelty has always existed in our world. We've always fought against it. We have to continue to do that. The way that we do that, us with the privilege of citizenship or us with the privilege of money or skin color, the way that we can help do this and be in solidarity with other people is to make sure that we help people not succumb to a propaganda campaign that forces them or convinces them to make bad decisions, right? I'm sure every single person here has been in a situation where they made the wrong decision because they were incredibly stressed out, right? Or worried, or they had financial issues, or someone in their family was in the hospital, or there's a myriad of reasons why we might make not perfect decisions in life, right? And I think this plays in the immigration space really, really importantly, because yes, there's a really hyper aggressive enforcement environment, and yes, things are kind of dark, right? But Colorado is probably one of the safest places for immigrants to be. Let me repeat that because I'm proud of it because I've spent 15 years of my career working on that. Colorado is one of the safest places to be an immigrant. Colorado is one of the safest places to be an immigrant. And we should be doing this when we talk about that because we should be proud about that. Now, where our community comes in is when people are suffering and they see and hear propaganda, we want to make sure they get to a good resource. That could be a lawyer, it could be a community organization, it could be a nonprofit, but we want to make sure people are making informed decisions. And I do this every day in my office. And there are people who will come in, a mother with 2 kids, and she's saying, like, I think I need to self-deport. And I say, why? And she says, because I think they're going to come arrest me at any moment and separate me from my children. And I say, okay, tell me more. Tell me why. Tell me why do you think that? well, here's what I hear on the news, and here's this thing, and then this one person had this happen to them, and ICE is grabbing everybody. And I say, well, have you ever had any trouble with the police? No. Have you ever been picked up by ICE? No. Do you have a driver's license? And can you drive? Yes. Are your kids okay? Are they in foster care or any sort of state situation? No. And then I can tell her, look, they're at the risk isn't zero, but the risk is a 1 out of 10. There's no reason for you to self-deport unless you want to. There's no realistic likelihood that immigration will pick you up. And even if they do, I'll get you out. And then we will fight to get your green card by showing the hardship to your children. And during that fight, you're going to qualify for a work permit and a social security card. So your life is going to get more stable if they come and pick you up. And once that person knows that, they can make a better set of decisions. But you don't hear that in the propaganda machine, right, of the Trump administration. And so I think one thing for us to do in community is just to make sure we're helping people access a good resource so they can get real information. Just like people here, some people have like really good financial planners that have helped them plan for retirement. It's like that. Like, let's plan. Let's be smart about things. Let's put together a good plan. Let's find a good community organization. Let's find a good lawyer to work with if we need them. And then just be ready and live our lives. So I do think that that's really important. And that's something that we can do in community in a way that I think is truly empowering for other people. Let's see here. Let me take a look at a couple of other things. And I'm sorry that I'm just talking nonstop, but I'm trying to address some of the other questions people have. Beth did have a very granular question. I think it was a Karen Larson asks, can detainees have calls with their families and items delivered while in detention centers? Yes, you can. However, detainees have to pay for their calls. So there is that. So you have to put money on the books for someone in detention. Legal calls don't cost anything. So if you've had an attorney, I often pass, updates and messages to my clients in detention. Like I'm not, my job isn't to be the operator, but like I pass information so that people know, hey, your kid's doing great. Like, they just finished the fifth grade play, type of thing. And, your wife sends a hello and she also said that, everybody at church misses you or whatever, those types of things are ways to lift people's spirits. Items delivered while in detention, really the only deliveries people get are if they're getting deported or they're taking voluntary departure, in which case you can drop off like a piece of luggage or some personal effects, but you don't really get to have stuff in detention. So that's a little bit different. You can buy stuff at the commissary, but um, you can't really give people things. Yeah. Let's see here. Let me just take a look at a couple of the other comments. See if I can. I think Meg Reed mentioned something called a difference between voluntary departure and self-deportation. Yes, those are different and or they're the same depending on what we mean by those terms, right? The self-deportation is a general term, I think, that the media uses and people use to basically for one person to say, I'm going to go ahead and leave on my own. I haven't really been contacted by immigration. I'm not in immigration court. Or I am in immigration court, but I've decided I'm just going to go. Like nobody's giving me an order to leave or anything like that. So I consider that to be more of like a self-removal or self-deportation. Voluntary departure is where you actually ask court, usually, for the permission to leave instead of taking a deportation. And the strategy behind that is usually sometimes you might say, well, I don't really have a good reason to stay, but I have built a life here. So, like, can you give me 120 days to wrap up my effects and I'll leave on my own? And courts will oftentimes grant that because, it is a valuable tool. The government gets what it wants, and the person at least still gets what they need, which is time to wrap up their affairs. So that does happen. The difference is that if you're in detention, they're not going to let you out for the 120 days. They're going to give you voluntary departure and they're going to put you on a plane or a bus and send you to your home country. Let's see here. Yeah, Kathy had a really great question, and this goes back to immigration judges. With immigration judges with 75 to 100 cases a day. Um, it's very hard to get like an accurate count on that, but you're not wrong, Kathy, in the sense that the volume of cases coming through court is really, really high, right? And then the detention space, it's easily 20 to 30 people a day, maybe 40 people a day, maybe 50 people a day. And they're in different postures. Some people are there for bond. Some people show up to their first court date and say, I don't want to fight anything, send me home, right? Other people show up and say, I'm going to fight as long as it takes. If it takes me 2 years, I'll fight at this for 2 years. But yeah, I do think that the purpose of that is that the immigration judges are being given case completion quotas and timelines for case completion that if they do not meet will result in their firing, right? And there's also been some pretty clear and obvious communications that if they grant things like asylum at too high a rate, if they grant bonds to people, they probably won't have a job. So it's a rigged system, to be blunt, right? To be a fair immigration judge, I don't like judges, but to give some credit to judges, those who want to be fair really, really have a hard time doing so in the immigration space. It's because there's an eye in the sky looking over them and looking at everything they do. So that makes it a very challenging system to work in. This is a great question too that you put in, Kathy, which is as ICE has been offering money to people to self-deport. Oh yeah, this is a big talking point. I have yet to have a client who's gotten paid. I know that's a big shocker that the Trump administration has promised to pay somebody and then not paid them. But I think that still, as of right now, I haven't seen that really pay out, literally and figuratively. Um, it's 7:21. I didn't know if it would make some sense to have anybody, if they want to like go off mute and make a comment or ask a more specific question or drop one in the chat. I'm happy to just spend the last 5 minutes
Yeah,
talking through any other questions people have.
that would be great. And maybe if you could just say a word about American citizens who've been naturalized and the threat of denaturalization.
Yeah, maybe I'll talk about that while people think through any other questions. That is a sort of a big talking point and sort of enforcement focus by the administration and by ICE. But I do think there's a huge propaganda component to that and very little likelihood of high success. Um, Once a person is naturalized, there's really only two, maybe three ways to denaturalize them. The first one is they got the naturalization by like overt fraud. Like they're like, I took somebody else's birth certificate and went and got a passport or something like that. Like just clearly, I'm not the citizen, right? That's an example of one. The second one is a little broader, but it's like I hid information from the government when I got my green card or when I got my citizenship that had the government known at the time would have given them a justification not only to deny my citizenship, but to take away my status. So that's a pretty high bar. I mean, there's a lot of talk about that, but they've really got to show like real, clear, obvious fraud or misrepresentation in somebody's immigration history. Like, for example, if I was married in another country and I came to the US and then I got married to a spouse and then I got my green card through them and then applied for my citizenship and I hid the marriage from the first time. That might give the government a justification to denaturalize me because I wouldn't be eligible for the green card because I was married in another country. So my marriage here wouldn't be legal. But it's a much bigger propaganda talking point than it is, I think, actually in something that the government can implement successfully against people. They've really got to actually have something real to be able to try to denaturalize somebody.
Okay, I know you guys all have questions, so just raise your hand and we'll call on you. Anybody? Margaret, you're on mute. Margaret, you're on mute.
I wonder if we were to go into a detention center, would there be a lot of um, people with a Caucasian or Anglo-Saxon background in there? Or are we really talking about Trump's effort to get rid of uh, people of color?
Oh, Margaret, thank you for the question. It's a great question. Statistically speaking, you would expect to see a fair amount of Caucasian folks who are visa overstays from Europe or other countries because they do comprise like a non-insignificant number of folks who are here without status. But you wouldn't see the statistics match up to the faces, right? Overwhelmingly, I would say probably 90% of the folks in detention are people of color. So even though the law doesn't have a racial aspect to it, of course it doesn't, right? The enforcement aspect of that does definitely appear to have a racial aspect to it. And this, in some ways, is similar to the criminal legal system, right? Where certain populations of people, mostly African American folks and other people of color, are overrepresented. And in the immigration space, it tends to be people from Latin America.
I, I think there's still people writing questions in the chat.
Yeah, I can try to address one or two of these. There's a question about primary caregivers of a person with a disability. What happens to the person with a disability? What can be done to support the person with a disability or a vulnerable person? For example, an elderly person. Yeah, I mean, I'll be blunt. ICE doesn't care. None of that matters to ICE. So that falls on us in civil society. What would happen to the disabled child or the child or the elderly person or a person who needs special assistance if their care provider was taken away from them? That will fall on civil society to figure out. Um, there are ways that me as an attorney can maybe fight to try to get that person a green card in the deportation process by showing if a person with a disability would suffer exceptional, extremely unusual hardship. Sometimes we can win a green card for that care provider under certain circumstances. It's a hard fight, but it's doable. We can sometimes win that. But there's no grace in the Trump administration simply because a person has a disability or some special sort of need. I wish there was, but there just isn't. And Celeste, I'd hate to follow up on this, but no, ICE doesn't care. I mean, the whole purpose is to deport parents, and in the process of deporting parents, hopefully you deport the kids too, right? Again, we have ways to defend against that, and we are able to win some cases by showing hardship to those children. But it doesn't stop the deportation process. And then maybe I'll end on Susan's question because it's an announcement from about 10 days ago. And it was, can you speak to the issue related to green card holders having to leave the country to reapply? And I'm going to switch this a little bit. It's not green card holders having to leave the country to reapply. It's anybody who be eligible to actually apply for a green card. And what that means is that the way the law works is if a person has come in on a visa, even if maybe they've overstayed the visa and then gotten married later in life, or their family member can apply for them through some mechanism, the law allows them to apply here in the country because they lawfully entered. But the policy change looks to try to force them to leave the country and apply from abroad. And that's going to be fought out in the courts. We think that that's probably illegal, but it is a major way that the Trump administration has decided not only are we going to clamp down on what the administration calls illegal immigration, but we're going to clamp down on legal immigration because this is literally people following the exact letter of the law. It'd be like saying, I'm filing my taxes like I'm supposed to. And they're like, well, now you have to go to Istanbul to file your taxes. even though you're supposed to file them here. So this is going to be a big issue, and it does impact several million people, right? And it'll be a big thing that we'll have to deal with. It's kind of an unfolding story for right now. So we'll see where this goes in the next couple of weeks.
Well, Hans, this has been incredible. We really appreciate all you're doing. We appreciate the time you took speaking to us. Um, hopefully you'll come back sometime, maybe under better circumstances.
Yeah.
But thank you very much.
Thank you. And I think the last thing, because I'm speaking to the League of Women Voters, I can't not say, and I'm not endorsing any candidate, but the power of us to elect local, state, and national leaders who will stand up for the civil rights of immigrants has never been more important.
Yes.
Thank you for your work to help make that happen.
Thank you so much, Hans. And if you like this program, I'd like to put in a plug for the League of Women Voters Leader of Democracy fundraiser next week, June 18th at 5:30, so you can buy a ticket on our website. Thank you very much. Beth, you want to stop the recording?
And thank you, everybody. Have a good evening.